You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Since January, we've been taking a close look at the issues affecting voters ahead of the 2024 presidential election, and the reasons why Americans across the political divide report feeling bad about the direction of the country. And since 2016, one issue that's been making voters feel especially uneasy is whether we can trust polls that measure the state of presidential races. Because for the last couple of election cycles, the polls have missed the coming strength of Donald Trump's performance.
Polling is a science, but it's not an exact science. And that I would encourage people to remember that polls are not predictions, they're really estimates. And part of the reason I think polls get criticized sometimes is there's this misunderstanding that it's a prediction.
That's Peter Francia, director of the East Carolina University Center for Survey Research. He's a professor of political science, so a lot of his work is focused on elections. But Professor Francia does surveys on just about every topic, anything you can imagine. And they all begin at the same place.
We don't have the time, the resources to reach out to every single person to find out what they're thinking. Of course, that would be completely unrealistic. So what you do is you take a sample, which is a smaller part of a larger whole. And the goals of that small sample of that larger population, that it looks like the larger population. That is, it needs to be representative. And so one way to achieve that is through random sampling.
The random in random sampling is what makes so many of us skeptical of the polling we see every day, because we just don't know who's being surveyed, whether they're telling the truth, whether respondents are actually going to vote, and whether what they say will actually matter on Election Day. But as of mid-September, a couple of weeks after the first Harris-Trump debate, Kamala Harris is leading in an average of the polls.
Yeah, it's about 3 points right now. Of course, there's some polls that are more favorable to Trump. There are actually even a few polls today that are out that have Harris up by even more than 3.
While the national average is what we may be obsessed with, Professor Francia spends most of his time focused on the battleground states, including North Carolina, his own backyard.
North Carolina surprised a lot of people in 2008 because it had been reliably Republican at the presidential level for quite some time. Jimmy Carter won in 1976, and then Republicans won for a really long time after that. Barack Obama's victory was by a razor-thin margin in North Carolina in 2008, but it led to a lot of speculation that North Carolina was moving the way of Virginia and would soon become a Democratic state. Those predictions proved wrong. That never happened.
There are many reasons why Democrats were optimistic that North Carolina might remain competitive going forward. A lot of high-tech jobs moved into the state, and that brought transplants from all over the country. It's a demographic swing that's been going on all over for the last few decades, hastened by the COVID-19 pandemic. In the last few cycles, Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia have also become more competitive in presidential elections, while not necessarily in local races, due to gerrymandering. Joe Biden won all 3 states in 2020. But for Professor Francia, all roads to victory still go through the Midwest.
Michigan and Wisconsin are about as close as you can get right now, according to the latest polls, and that's not surprising. They were 2 of the closest states in 2016 and in 2020. They're critically important, both states. If Kamala Harris is able to win Michigan, Wisconsin, and let's throw in Pennsylvania, because I think Pennsylvania may be the most important for the Democrats, the Harris campaign, if they lose Pennsylvania, they could still win. There are scenarios, but realistic ones, it's hard to find a path if she doesn't win Pennsylvania. So those 3 states are really critical. They were key to Trump's victory in 2016. And if Trump can win them again in 2024, he's going to be the next president.
The margins are razor thin in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Some polls show Harris leading, others Trump. Because the Midwest is so consequential to November's results, Professor Francia suggests not putting all your energy into national polls.
I don't think that the 3-point national lead was the key thing to be looking at. It's to look at those 7 states that we were just talking about. That's everything. Donald Trump lost the popular vote in 2016 and still had more than 300 electoral college votes, and you only need 270. So even though the state polls have been a little bit less accurate than the national polls, looking at those state polls is really the best way to get perspective on where this might end up on Election Day.
Despite the fact we know the contest will come down to a handful of states, we can't stop ourselves from looking at the daily updates of where the race stands. We need to know what's happening, even if we don't fully trust what we're seeing. For skeptical voters who look at the latest polls and discount everything because of what happened in 2016, Professor Francia has a reminder.
Polls have a margin of error of plus or minus 3 for each candidate. So the poll wasn't wrong. It was within that range of estimate, but it's often not interpreted that way. And sometimes that is hard for the pollster to explain to the critics who say, well, see, the polls got it wrong, when really the polls, if they're within the margin of error, then the poll actually, statistically speaking, did not get it wrong.
Professor Francia is measured, but it's clear even he doesn't want his data to be seen as inaccurate, wrong. And in a media landscape where the most sensational stories and the most confident predictions get the most press, it makes sense when pollsters like Nate Silver make strong bets. They want to be right. And after all, Silver became famous for going 49 out of 50 in 2008. Right now, Silver has Harris up by about 3 points in his polling model. But he's been drawing fire for predicting Trump may still have the advantage because of the Electoral College. Democrats don't want to believe it, and others don't believe any of it.
It's looking like Kamala Harris, after the first debate, is up about 3 percentage points in national polls. Do you trust those numbers?
Absolutely not.
You don't have to look hard to find people who are skeptical these days. About everything. They don't trust cops, politicians, Supreme Court judges, people like me, journalists, who talk about all the things people are skeptical about. But the one thing we all want to believe in, are the numbers, the data, the certainty that the candidate we choose, who we're on the sidelines rooting for, will deliver on their promise for a better version of America. Except for Samaya Garza.
There's never going to be a way for them to make it 100% accurate, because the reality of it is you don't know what's in someone's head on Election Day.
And Samaya would know. She's 24, works as a legal clerk at a law firm in Detroit, and she's one of a few 100,000 voters, maybe less, that will decide who wins the presidential election in November. We are 49 days away from the election. Who are you planning to vote for?
That's a very good question. I have not decided on who I'm going to vote for, and don't get mad at me, but if at all.
Samaya is weighing her options, but not between the two current candidates.
I don't have to list the reasons as to why I don't want to vote for Trump. I'm a Mexican, Muslim, American, so woman. I'm not exactly his favorite or his target demographic.
This is the second time she's been able to vote in a U.S. presidential election. And that she's considering not doing it at all says a lot. Samaya grew up in Qatar. She went to a high school started by a former U.S. ambassador, took all sorts of classes about politics, and loved watching American news.
I actually watched the 2016 election in Georgetown University in Qatar with the American ambassador there. We had to leave to go to the university at like 4 a.m., I want to say, in the morning. And there was this room where we all sat in, and surprisingly, in the Middle East, a lot of people did support Trump. So it was an experience.
But 4 years after casting her first ballot in 2020, Samaya is doing some soul searching.
I voted for Biden, and I regret it. I essentially just voted for not Trump. So that's really why I voted for Biden. He was just the other option. He was a placeholder. And then after October 7th, it just solidified to me that, okay, well, both of them suck.
To be clear, Samaya is referring to Israel's military response to the October 7th attack by Hamas, not the attack itself.
And while I understand that October 7th, it was horrible, I think that this unconditional and unwavering support that he's given to Israel, I don't agree with it. Meanwhile, we have a bunch of issues in our country that we haven't been able to solve, and he's sending billions of dollars overseas. It comes down to is that I'm tired of having the blood of other people on my hands. That's why it's taking me so long to make a decision, because it's a big decision to make.
Samaya says her friends have been trying to convince her to vote for Vice President Kamala Harris, but that her mind, it isn't easily changed.
I felt very guilty for voting for Joe Biden, and I don't want to feel that way again if I put my trust in Kamala Harris, because I did put my trust in Joe Biden and that didn't work out. I feel almost betrayed by our former president, where I don't want to have that feeling again and feel like I regret voting for someone this time around. I think that if Kamala Harris were to take accountability for the egregious charges that she's imposed and sentences that she's imposed on people in the past in her time as a prosecutor, and acknowledge suffering that Palestinians have been enduring for the past 80 years, I would vote for her. I just want her to be open and honest with us. Not be a hypocrite, not tell us what we want to hear, tell us what you actually believe and what you actually want to implement.
Who do you think is going to win?
That's hard to say, but from the people, I've been in school with, from the people that live in the building that I live in, people have a lot of support for Kamala Harris. So if I were to gun to my head to say, who do you think would win? I think it would be Kamala.
When you've got a gun to your head, sometimes you just got to make your best guess. For On Shifting Ground, I'm Mateo Schimpf.
Why do we spend so much time talking about national polls? For one thing, we love a good bet, a prediction, something we can point to and say, oh yeah, or oh no. Maybe we want to turn on the TV and think, yeah, I know a little bit more than the next guy. But do I? With all the surveying and number crunching, are our predictions any better than the flip of a coin? Before we've even had the chance to catch a breath, we're leaping from the world of nonstop polling to the world of forecasting, odds-making, betting markets, and they're even harder to credit in a fluid, long, changing electorate than the straight-up question, who are you voting for? Have opinion researchers and data scientists managed to keep up with the way the country has changed? And now that there are so many companies, universities, news organizations, campaign consulting firms in on the game, what's an A-plus poll versus a grade C poll anyway? And what in the world is a betting market? Justin Grimmer is a political science professor and senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. He's the 2022 co-author of the book Text as Data, a new framework for machine learning and the social sciences. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thanks for having me.
Is this obsession, this day-to-day following of election forecasting, still a pretty new thing?
It is certainly new within the framework of American political campaigns. So the obsession with forecasting really started in 2008 when Nate Silver first started making his forecasts. And what was remarkable about 2008 and then in 2012 is that he was able to perform seemingly well on those forecasts, selecting Barack Obama to win both of those elections. After that, people really started to pay a lot of attention to these forecasts, and we saw a real proliferation of these forecasts across different news outlets.
But when you say people started to pay attention, there was a very interesting thing. As someone who covers campaigns and listens hard to what people say about them, I had people say back to me, wow, that was crazy. That was so out of line. Nate Silver said she was going to win with 88%. There was a very basic understanding of what a forecast model was and what it was telling you about the shape of a race in the last days of a campaign.
There's a real risk of confusing two different quantities that an election forecast could give us. One quantity it could tell us is the probability of someone winning. And I believe in 2016, Nate Silver had Hillary Clinton having a 60% chance of winning the election. Quite separate from that is the vote share that someone would expect to receive. And Hillary Clinton having a 60% chance of winning is very consistent with it being a razor close election. And just one more, I think, really important point is it's hard to know what exactly that 60% from these models means. Usually, when we teach statistics, we would say that 60% would mean if I ran the election 100 times, 60 times Hillary Clinton would win, 40 times Donald Trump would win. But of course, we don't get to run presidential elections 100 times. We only get to run the 2016 election once, and we're only on our 60th presidential election in U.S. history. So we're still pretty far away, I think, from having those probabilities make much sense.
When you run the numbers, and I often hear data scientists referring to running the numbers or running scenarios, what is it that you're feeding into a computer, and what are you asking those numbers to tell us?
Yes, anytime you hear someone say running the numbers or I've done this calculation, there's going to be two key inputs. One's going to be data from the world. And as you mentioned in your introduction, some of that could be survey data. It could be other things as well, though. It could be characteristics of the economy, such as the unemployment rate. It could be the extent to which the U.S. is involved in international affairs, or it could even be about how the public's evaluating the incumbent president, the current approval rating. All of that would be taken as data inputs to the model. Then the model is also going to take some assumptions that could be based on prior elections, or it could be based on things the analyst thinks is possible. For example, what is the plausible polling error in a particular election, and how are those polling errors related across different states? Knowing the answer to that question is key to getting the forecast correct. And as you can imagine, that's very difficult to know. How is polling in this election going to be different than prior elections? And how are these results going to be related to each other?
Are we still in the state of the art where we're tweaking the variables that we plug into these scenarios?
It will depend upon the particular forecast that's being deployed. For example, 538, which Nate Silver no longer runs. Now, G. Elliott Morris runs that particular model. And midway through the 2024 campaign, he recalibrated the way the model was fitting the data and merging this information, the data and assumptions together to reach the conclusion. Nate Silver makes the claim that he hasn't modified the model much over time, and I think that's borne out. Other election forecasters will make small tweaks, usually long before the election begins, in ways in which they think they'll help their model perform better. But it is the case that sometimes over the course of the election, people will make these tweaks in order to adjust for particular facts or new pieces of information that are available.
My antenna starts to twitch a little bit when you talk about tweaking the model, because I wonder how much you can tweak the model before numbers from different years and different surveys and different scenarios are no longer comparable to each other, don't give you a longitudinal view of a situation.
I think this is an important intuition. Ideally, what we'd have is lots and lots of data where we could say, I don't really have to make a strong assumption here. I can just let the historical record speak for the way I'm going to construct this model. And of course, in any setting, past performance doesn't promise future success. However, we could say, well, the reason I'm making this decision is this is how it's been consistently across many, many prior forecasts that I've made. The unfortunate reality about presidential elections is that we don't have this long track record to guide these sorts of decisions. And as a result of that, we don't have that nice long historical record to really guide these modeling decisions. And that means a well-intentioned analyst, someone who's not trying to bias the results or otherwise come up with results for a particular output, just trying to come up with something reasonable, will be in a position where they have to make these consequential assumptions that will have a profound effect on the determination they make.
I can see the appeal, I really can, of being able to do this. But I'm also a little skeptical because elections are such individual animals. So yeah, you may say, well, what was the Dow? What was inflation that year? What was unemployment? What's party registration in key states? But there's a sort of X factor that I think is really hard to catch with data science about how people are feeling and what the atmosphere is like, and things that I suspect are pretty hard to quantify, pretty hard to measure in a way that they're easily loaded into a program.
We can look at elections, and we certainly know that historically, some things have a consistent relationship with vote choice. We know the state of the economy, the first or second quarter of a presidential election year, can tell us something about how the incumbent party is going to perform in that election. It's not a perfect one-to-one relationship, but there's some relationship there. And so another way to think about what that means is if it's going to be a landslide race, these fundamental characteristics, these long historical relationships will tell us a lot. And even in a close race, they tell us something. We know Wyoming is going to go red and California is going to go blue. But what's important about these recent elections is that they're so close that these fundamentals and even the polls can't resolve this uncertainty that we have. When an election is decided by 40,000 votes across 3 states, you're right, this X factor, the feelings of these independent voters and which candidate they find more appealing or who happens to be mobilized to go to the polls, those things are going to be determinative. And that's very hard for us to model because it is such a small segment of the population and there's so much inherent randomness in whether those things happen.
People who have been listening to our conversation and saying, yeah, oh, no, oh, yeah, let's complicate their lives just a little bit more. In a recent article you wrote for Politico, you said, the reality is there's far less precision and far more punditry than forecasters admit. You arguing against your own models here?
So I would hope not, but I think we should have some clarity with the public about what these models can do. It certainly can be useful to take polling data from many firms and to bring that together, to average those data together. I think that's probably preferable to overreacting to a single poll. And it could be interesting to look at how the current polling compares to polling in prior years. But when forecasters do things like create a probability that says it's 70% chance Clinton's going to win and a 30% chance Trump's going to win, that's not an exercise in precise statistics. That's not an exercise that'll be grounded in data. That is an exercise that's grounded in the very particular assumptions of their model. And really what's interesting is that different assumptions that they could have made in their model would move that probability around a lot. In fact, in this current election, we're seeing this right now, where Nate Silver's model, which based on a purely statistical basis, if you were to say, look at this model, one would say that's probably very reasonable. And if you were to look at G. Elliott Morris's model at 538, you'd say that's also probably a very reasonable model. And yet they reach different conclusions about who's ahead in the race, and they have very different probabilities about who's ahead. And that sort of fundamental uncertainty is what I have in mind.
Are people in this still developing industry caught a little wrong-footed by the fact that this is such a novel year, given the departure of the incumbent and the nominee, the all but certain nominee of the party, as late as it happened in the game, that a lot of the things that you might otherwise model and assume from other campaigns and from this year are just invalid or don't match up very well?
That's part of the art and the challenge of forecasting. And we think about evaluating these models. We won't know until after the fact we can tell the story now that this is an election unlike any other. I mean, for goodness sakes, one candidate had an assassination attempt, nearly died shortly after another candidate dropped out. We could say that this is completely bespoke and we can't use these models. On the other hand, maybe it's the case that the public has a short attention span, and really this campaign's going to fall into a pretty standard campaign dynamic where people who vote for Democrats will vote for Democrats, Republicans for Republicans, and it'll come down to mobilization and the small number of swing voters. It's really hard to know, and that itself would be a forecast that's hard to make.
Does the applicability of the model increase as Election Day draws closer?
It would be appealing if
just the fact that I give you pause with that question is telling me something.
Ideally, what we'd be able to do is we have lots and lots of election outcomes. We know how much better we're getting as Elections Day gets closer. I think it is the case that as Election Day gets closer, it becomes clear some states will be in play or not. So that's important. But if we're focused on something like picking the winner, the fundamental problem is going to be in these recent presidential elections that there'll be a small set of states that are going to be decided by a very small set of votes. And that margin is so small that even running lots of polls or having deep insight into how factors will be affecting vote choices won't be enough to resolve the uncertainty in who's going to win those states.
In some ways, this presumes to be a world of disinterestedness and rationality and arm's length assessment. And I'm wondering whether, when the data is inconclusive or points to several different scenarios, the act of interpretation comes in.
There's certainly a temptation from the public to view a lot of forecasts this way as well. So in recent weeks, Nate Silver has taken a lot of criticism from folks on the left because they say his forecast is biased in inappropriate ways towards Trump. And the folks that have been offering this criticism spin some conspiracy about this has to do with Silver's involvement with betting markets and various pro-Trump people. I think there's a few ways in which these criticisms are misguided. One is that many of these decisions are intentionally made long before we know what the data will look like. So we talked about tweaking the models a little bit earlier. If you can minimize the amount of tweaking that you'll make available, you're going to make decisions when they're in a dispassionate place. You won't know what could possibly bias your model to favor one candidate or the other. The second thing I'd say is the hope would be that at some point we'll have enough data to evaluate this, and that would work against you. You would say, usually in forecasting, you could have whatever biases you want. We'll have reality is going to intervene and we'll know if you're biased. The unfortunate thing about elections, however, is that we're just really not going to get enough of those data points. We're not going to see enough election results for someone who was biased to pay a price. And that's all the more true because, as you've noted, every election, things are a little bit different. And so it's hard to imagine that the same accuracy you had in 2016 would be your accuracy in 2024. And so it's easy to say, oh, I was biased, I missed, I'm making a probabilistic forecast. And so that does help people evade accountability a bit.
When we turn the conversation from forecasting models to betting marketplaces, are we talking about a very different beast? And does the public's impression of one poison the other?
Yeah, betting markets are very interesting. We evaluate them a bit in a paper that we wrote, and you end up reaching a very similar conclusion to evaluate whether aggregating information in a betting market where individuals are purchasing contracts that either Trump or Harris will win, and those contracts will resolve for $1 for every person who purchased the Trump contract and $1 for every person who purchased the Harris contract. The hope would be that that aggregates up a lot of information and would pay a penalty for having these biases. If you have a pro-Trump bias, you will directly lose money in the betting market, is the hope. The problem, of course, in these markets is, first, they're not always subject to lots of money being involved. So people will do this for fun. They'll say, oh, I'm going to go buy some contracts for fun. And as a result of that, maybe they're not reflecting the current state of this information. But there is some evidence that individuals who used forecasts from, say, 538, for example, could do better in the betting markets, which would suggest that there is some money kicking around in these markets that's not smart money. It's not money that's following all the information, because 538 forecast and investing based on that could do a little bit better. Just to portray the hope of what a betting market is, I think that people think that there'll be such a financial incentive to resolve our uncertainty about this election that individuals would go out and acquire as much information as they could in order to make the right contract purchase, in order to make money. Again, the idea is that they're going to be the ones who acquire this information. So even if they're not representative, they'll have this financial incentive to figure out what the American public is thinking.
What should my business be doing? I think writ large, we have sometimes been very misleading about what forecasting models and what the latest polls have to tell us. Is there a way that we could be reporting this that might be more useful and, of course, more accurate to the listening public?
Yes. So one of the big pieces of advice that comes from this line of research is that we should avoid articulating probabilities because those are so easily confused for vote shares. People very easily will confuse the 80% chance of winning with an 80% vote share, and that can lead to a real problem and even depressed turnout. But more to the point, I think it's fine to present polling averages or to give a state of the race as far as choices, but we shouldn't portray that we have some deep insight into what's going to happen or even how much uncertainty we have about what's going to happen. We know what the polling averages are now, and we know where the candidates tell us they think the race is close and where they'll be expending effort. But the anxiety that goes along with the presidential campaign is going to be there for everybody, and we can't get rid of that anxiety with these forecasting models. Instead, we can just report what the candidates are doing and encourage people who are feeling anxious to participate in the political process.
One election forecaster, maybe tongue-in-cheek, maybe not, said, well, we're probably better than dart-throwing monkeys. Are we?
It really depends on what we're evaluating. If we wanted to say, are election forecasters better than a dart-throwing monkey at picking state winners? That's certainly true. Many other people are good at that. I think, a well-informed observer of American politics can pick the way most states are going to go. The thing that's challenging is if we were to say they're better than this random monkey or random just other forecaster at picking the national winner, that's a thing we just don't know. And I think forecasters want to say, well, we make all of these other forecasts. We should get credit for those. But the thing that's challenging is that there are some people who claim to be very good at forecasting, who only forecast the US presidential election. And I think some of these probabilistic forecasters try to dismiss those forecasts, but they're still there and viable. And the people who make them think they're very accurate. And so it's important to note that we need lots more information in order to make that distinction.
That's Justin Grimmer. He's co-author of the book Text as Data, a new framework for machine learning and the social sciences. Great to talk to you.
Great talking with you. Thank you.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, a data scientist on why polls missed Trump voters in the last two election cycles, and whether they'll get them wrong again in November. If you missed any part of this episode, or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. I've covered presidential campaigns since the Reagan administration, and accurate polling has been a growing challenge all during that era. As our tools have improved, John and Jane Q. Public have become more elusive. Back in the 80s, pollsters reached American households via landline telephone. The method was reliable because relatively few homes had access to more than one phone line, and call screening technology was scarce. So people also used to answer unknown numbers. Political scientists could relatively accurately map registered and likely voters. But the proliferation of cell phones changed everything. Today, because of call screening, it's grown exponentially harder to get voters to answer a call, much less to get them to answer about how they're feeling around the election. Pollsters are also using online surveys to take a measure of the electorate, but these results are especially unreliable because it's easier for people not to be honest. As of this recording, Kamala Harris remains ahead of Donald Trump. But pollsters underestimated Trump's support in the last two presidential election cycles. Will they miss Trump turnout once again? Joining me to break down how polling works and what the data actually says is Dr. Natalie Jackson, Vice President at GQR. She spent nearly 2 decades developing extensive expertise in survey research, methodology, and political polling. Her research is focused on how people form opinions and how polls are formulated. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thanks for having me.
You probably see a lot of good and bad practice when it comes to communicating what polls say to the public. So what would you like to discourage right from the outset? What do you want us not to do?
I would love for people to not take poll numbers quite so literally or even quite so seriously. There are a lot of people out there who live and die by the changes in the polls every day. How they think about the world seems to shift based on whether Kamala Harris is up 1 point or Donald Trump is up 1 point. And that just isn't something that polls are precise enough to tell us.
Sometimes there's a feeling when I talk to pollsters, when I watch the polls closely, that there's a little bit of fighting the last war. They're going back to the models. When they get a race wrong, when they get a big call wrong, they want to understand why, which is great. And they go back to looking at, all right, well, I had this representative group of people. Did I have enough urban as opposed to suburban as opposed to rural people? Did I have enough high propensity as opposed to low propensity voters? Did I have enough high income as opposed to low income people? Did I have my models right? What do we understand about the way Donald Trump polls now that he's in his third national race?
I think you're exactly right to pick up on fighting the last war because, quite honestly, that's all we can fight. Are we looking too much at the past? You have to balance the things that went wrong before with the things that could go wrong now. Polling error works in both directions. I think there are a lot of assumptions that because polls underestimated Trump twice, that it's going to happen again. I think we understand a lot more about Trump voters than we did and understand that there is an extremely high risk of underestimating Trump turnout. But I think the one thing that I get a lot of comfort out of right now is that Donald Trump is polling about where he was in 2020, his vote share in 2020. He's getting that 46-47%. That seems to be where he's stuck. In a two-way race, he sticks at that 46-47, maybe occasionally 48 mark. So that to me says we're doing a decent job of at least capturing the ballpark, which is really all a poll can do.
When you say we don't see his vote share shifting a lot, that interests me because I'm wondering if that's kind of true of the electorate at large. This particular cycle, there aren't great big swings, and the kind of events like conventions, like an attempted assassination, it feels less likely to bring big swings or bubbles in public sentiment.
Right. When we're talking about bubbles these days, we're talking about 1 or 2, maybe 3 percentage points. A few decades ago, opinion swung around a lot more. We were not as polarized. People didn't just retreat into their camps. So it's just a tighter environment. We're talking about elections that are decided by 80,000 votes across 3 states. It's just hard to move anything. And that's why I said earlier, there are people who move. It's just a small group.
Is there a necessity to overweight Republicans in polling because they tend to be less responsive, less willing to talk to pollsters, less reachable than Democrats, in part as an outgrowth of the fact that they trust pollsters less?
There are a couple of factors at play. One is not trusting pollsters, but it's not just pollsters. A lot of Trump voters are low trust across the board. And pollsters are just kind of wrapped in that. The other piece of it is that education polarization, meaning over the last 8 years or so, we've seen Americans really shift by their education level. So where it used to be that Democrats got a good number of white voters without a college degree, those voters have shifted more Republican. Trump has appealed to them. They've shifted over that direction. And in general, people without a college degree, with the type of jobs they're working and the practices that we use for polling, they're harder to reach. And some of that's our fault, right? Because we're using the internet. Well, if you're working a job where you're not sitting at a computer all day, you're not going to answer an online survey that as much. If you're working shift work and we're only calling from 5 to 9 p.m., we're not going to get those people. And that trend hasn't changed. What's changed is how it affected our estimates, right? Because of how people sorted themselves. And so now it's a problem, even though we've known for a long time that we struggle to get in touch with those people. And different pollsters deal with it differently. Some people don't really pay that much attention to it on the front end, and they get the data they get. And then they use weighting processes to essentially weight up all of those non-college Republicans. Some pollsters do a lot more work at the front end to try to make sure, take more time, do more targeting in areas and people that you think are in that category. Call a lot more of them so that even when they answer less, you still get enough. I tend to lean toward that practice, err on the side of spending more time, which usually means more money, and get more voices in your survey. You may still have to wait to make them meet some benchmarks, but at least you have more voices. You're making the weights do less work.
If I was to design an imaginary pool, yeah, it would perfectly represent America in all its amazing, dazzling diversity. But that doesn't necessarily capture who votes. If my pool was 20% Latino, the vote is not 20% Latino. And how do you compensate for those changes? And how do you take these things into account both before and after your numbers are in?
There are several ways of doing that. One is simply to ask people if they're going to vote. And if they tell you they're not going to vote, take them out of the sample. The Marist NPR PBS polls usually report results for all adults, registered voters, and then they take the people who say they're absolutely certain to vote. And that's kind of their version of a likely voter. There are some pollsters that build models of what the electorate looks like. So instead of recruiting a sample that looks like the population, we're recruiting a sample that looks like our model of what the electorate is going to look like. There are many ways to do this. And one of kind of the secret sauce parts of polling that I think it would benefit the world to know a little bit more about.
One of the interesting variables in the 2024 race is that unlike the, as old as polling results where you've got the same candidate in April and June and October, on the Democratic side, you now have a different candidate. So people who might have turned up in an RV's, registered voters, but not in an LV's, likely voter column, may have switched since Joe Biden dropped out of the race. Are you dealing with a electorate right now whose shape and composition and size has changed since mid-July?
Yes, in short. Not necessarily in its overall composition, but we've seen groups shift. All the things that have been discussed. Biden was lagging with Black voters. He was lagging with Hispanic voters. He was lagging with young voters. All of those groups have suddenly started looking way more normal. A few months ago, looking at data was just like, what is this? These groups were just not acting the way they typically do politically. And while it's possible that there are big changes happening, we couldn't really point to one other than Joe Biden's age. Then with the candidate switch, the data started looking as you would expect again. And what happened was the people who were skittish about Biden's age had gone to third party and undecided, and they kind of came back in. The other thing that we've seen is a couple of months ago, the low propensity voters looked more like Democrats than Republicans. And typically low propensity voters lean Republican. But that has reversed now too, where it's gone back to where the lower propensity voters look a little more Republican. So that indicates that we did have a bit of a shift in who is saying they're most likely to vote and who's not, that benefited Democrats. Yeah, things shifted very suddenly, very quickly. I hope a lot of people get to do research on the before and after data because it's just fascinating.
Does that mean that the final composition of the electorate might be more fluid between today and November 5th? So you have to be sort of expecting the unexpected in a way that you don't normally. And can you capture it in the way you do your work?
We don't know until we know. One of the things that I like to point out to people is that surveying and polling is a sample based on a population. And we're assuming that we know who that population is. When we're talking about likely voters, we don't know who the population is because the election hasn't happened yet. So we're really pushing at the limit statistically of what the design can do. And so, of course, we're going to have errors. Some of that comes from systematic problems like underestimating Trump voters. And some of that comes from just being a little bit wrong about who was going to turn out to vote. You know, in an environment like the ones we've seen in the last 8 years, the last 3 elections, we've seen voter registration moving and shifting around a lot. We have these bursts of new registrations, and that makes it hard to know, are those new registrants going to turn out to vote? We're not sure. When we talk about looking at voter lists to know if people are going to vote, the best way to know someone will vote is if they voted before. So if they're a new registrant, we have no information.
Yeah, really.
So for me personally, over the last 3 elections, I have dropped any pretense of this is going to be exactly right, and we've cracked the nut of how to predict an electorate, because I don't think anybody knows at this point. We're all making very highly educated expert guesses, but they are subject to being wrong.
Looking ahead at the next 8 weeks or so, opinion research also involves story. You hear things that people tell you, patterns in the things that people tell you. What role does narrative play in your work? And can you give us some examples of some things that you've been hearing that you'll be waiting to see how they fall out by the time we get to November 5th?
Sure. For most of this campaign cycle, most of 2024, we've been hearing a lot about voters hurting economically. Their salaries, their wages are not keeping up with inflation. Everything costs more. There's a real sense of struggle out there. Even when you talk to people who are not struggling, they say, oh, but I know family members, friends, neighbors, I'm doing fine, but many people are not, is kind of the approach you hear even from people who say they're doing okay. That really is a dominant narrative that I think media sometimes tends to overlook because they're not necessarily speaking with people. They're speaking with others who are saying the economy is actually doing really well, which is something you just can't tell people that are hurting. So that's been a big thing in the data and in focus groups in what people will say. The other things really split by party. Economy is across the board. Everyone's worried about that. Republicans are super worried about the border. If you hear about the border being a top issue for voters, that's Republicans driving it. If you hear about abortion being a top issue for voters, it's Democrats driving that. You have those three things at the top of the issues list all the time, and they kind of switch places depending on whether you have more Republicans or more Democrats.
That great big yawning chasm in a lot of data sets between how people rate their own lives and how they think everybody else is doing, I don't know. It tells me a lot. I don't know if somebody was paying me for advice, like GQR is paid for advice, how I'd design an appeal to voters around that really hard to pick apart dichotomy.
There are some things that we can push on, some common themes of making sure that groceries are affordable, making sure housing is adequate. The parties differ on how to address those issues, but there are some commonalities where you can appeal to ways to make things better, and those are credible, right? The other thing I'll say is I do think a large part of it, and we don't talk about this much as a society, but I think the pandemic economy still has people very skittish. The rug was pulled out from under everybody so fast in such a jarring, dramatic way in March of 2020 that I think the psychology and the leftover trauma of that still affects how people view the economy. It doesn't help that we did have huge inflation coming off of that when everything was finally opened back up. Of course, we were going to have an inflation bump. That was just kind of the way the economy works. But it added to this sense of we're not safe in this economy. And I think that has continued to reverberate around.
Well, I'm one seat of the pants sociologist who says that part is going to be with us for a long time. Natalie Jackson, thank you so much for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Yeah, thank you.
The election is right around the corner. What could derail either of the candidates before November? On Tuesday, October 15th, I'll be live in San Francisco for a special conversation about October surprises and what could trip up Harris or Trump at the finish line. You can buy tickets at commonwealthclub.org. You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you, with special support from Mark and Maury Jane Perry and Ann and Greg Avis. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.